Y'all know that I love to talk about Nazis, so Terry Pratchett gave me some werewolf Nazis, and I'm gonna talk about them. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about Discworld books. This is the next step in our ongoing Great Discworld read-along. This is volume 24 in publication order, The Fifth Elephant, another City Watch book. And if you want to join us, next up is The Truth, and we'll probably talk about it on the 11th of December. So you have time to get all caught up. This one is another, well, almost standalone with no prior book, so you can just go and join us there if you want. I'll leave the link to the Discord down below, so if you want to join us, that would be glorious. Otherwise, well, just enjoy this video, and I'll, give a quick synopsis before I go into why this particular book is one of my favorite Discworld novels. So let's get started, shall we? Alright. The Fifth Elephant is, as I said, a City Watch book, and a fairly dark one. I would say this one is probably where Discworld actually gets modern. Now, that's obviously clear with the technology of the heliograph, the clacks, as Terry Pratchett calls it, the semaphore towers. But there's other things here that make Discworld in this book way more complicated, way more complex, and way more modern in a lot of ways. It is also an action-packed book, and it deals with these kind of topics. So here's your story synopsis. A lot of people have to go to Uberwald, which was introduced last book, that being Carpe Jugulum. And this time round, Sam Vimes, Angua, and other people are ending up in Uberwald, and some political and not so political intrigues, and Sam Vimes has to deal with them in a very Vimesian fashion. That's your non-spoiler introduction. As I said, it's action-packed, it's dark, and it is, I would say, one of Terry Pratchett's best Discworld novels. So do yourself the favor, go and read it. You will not regret it. I promise you that. And now, I'll take a quick drink while you read the book. It's not that long. And then we'll talk about spoilerish views on this book. Alright, let's do the spoilery things. Alright. So let's start exactly with what I meant. This is a modern Discworld, and it's a very complex Discworld with lots of individual elements that are part of that. And this shows very much in The Fifth Elephant in a lot of ways. So yeah, technology has moved forward, but the politics have also moved forward. And as we all know, our modern world is, well, not exactly a fun place to be, but it's also one with all kinds of nuances. That means even though he's not coming out and saying it, we find elements of colonialism, elements of imperialism, and so forth happening in Discworld in this area. What do I mean? Well, the main setup is that all the, let's call them civilized Western countries like Ankh-Morpork, Genoa, and, well, apparently even Clash. So those people have discovered Uberwald, which, is a fantastic word, Uberwald being German for Transylvania, and that's all we know about it. Have discovered Uberwald becoming a nation, sort of, almost, and trying to, get their hooks in to get the best and most favorable trade deals and all these other things that more powerful nations want from less developed places. Sound familiar? Right. And there's something that happens here that I think is very interesting. The Sam Vimes, Lord Veterinary dialectics, because of the way Sam Vimes is working and the way Veterinary is talking, we can, or Terry Pratchett can, unmask the political language of that trade exploitation. That is still going on nowadays, right? I mean, just because we're no longer calling them colonies doesn't mean we have stopped exploiting countries that are poorer or less developed in technological senses, right? And there's that market scene where, in the beginning, where Veterinary talks about how they want to strengthen trade connections and all of these things, and Sam Vimes then goes and says, like, it's like this big suet pudding that everyone has discovered, so we're going there with knife, spoon, and fork to shovel as much on our plates as we can. And that, I think, is an interesting technique for Pratchett to use, because, that's very Vimesian to say it, but it's also very realistic. And having Veterinary use the more political language for, trade connections, helping them, and so forth, shows how we approach these things. Now, the complex answer here is, of course, that Veterinary has good reasons to do that. He's not just, an asshole exploiting other places. It's kind of his job to run the country that way. So through having those two characters talk about it, Terry Pratchett does, expose that very specific mechanism in an interesting way that I found, fascinating. Another part is, of course, the refugee situation, parallel societies. And we have to see this as written in the late 90s. The Cold War is over, and you can certainly also see Uberwald as sort of an analog for the former Eastern Bloc, the former Soviet Union and connected states. And what happened after the fall of the Iron Curtain is, of course, that a lot of people moved from there into the West, in particular also into Britain, which is, the basis for a lot of Pratchett's views on politics. And you suddenly have people that, talk in their own language, even though they're in a different country, that organize their society in parallel to the one that they live in. And we have exactly that happening in Discworld with the Uberwelt dwarfs that, do in fact among themselves still use the laws and customs of their home and so forth. And Sam Vimes, as, the organization, in this case being the City Watch, is not exactly very happy with it. And while there is no full, explanation of how things will, turn out and what Pratchett's personal perspective on that is, I think it's interesting that it is shown that there are, reasons for those people to come to a more prosperous place, in this case Ankh-Morpork, and do their things there. They have vital reasons for migration, which, great step there, because a lot of people deny that shit still. But also there are situations where integration into a new society is difficult, and it is easier if there's enough people of a specific, nationality or ethnicity to just, talk your own language, talk with your own people. It feels better. Plus you have that connection to back home, something that comes into this book as well, right? When we have the idea that all those dwarfs want to go back home because they're still connected to their homes in that regard. So once again, this world has become way more complicated in these areas, because these are just elements that are touched upon. This is not yet the main plot, right? That goes somewhere entirely different. So there we are with that part, and I just wanted to point those out. There's more elements like that in the story, but I found it important to mention that Terry Pratchett is looking at a Discworld that is, in a lot of its issues, suddenly way more modern and complicated in that regard. All right, let's talk about the next part. Action movie, action stars, and stuff like that. So the main plot is, of course, action-driven, because it is about Sam Vimes being set up, being framed, fleeing as an individual, fighting against all kinds of people, surviving and saving the day. There's obviously more, but this is a classic action plot. And the interesting thing is that Sam Vimes, who is in Ankh-Morpork, the establishment, I mean, he's the boss of the City Watch, he's the commander of the City Watch. It don't get much more official in this specific fantasy world. But in Uberwald, he's not. He's actually on his own. And that makes it possible for Terry Pratchett to actually use him like an action hero, because, action heroes are usually outside the law, and sometimes even have to fight the law, because the law is not where we want it to be, which is why so many action movies, appeal to so many, more conservative, more masculine kind of types because they exemplify that very specific mentality of us having to go outside the law to fight things because the world is corrupt and bad. And it's interesting how Pratchett does that by transferring Vimes into this other place. Now, not every take on different customs and cultural relativism in this book are, perfect. But once again, it's a short book, and Pratchett can only show that those, differences in culture exist, and that they don't mean that everything is possible and morally equivalent. So good for Pratchett there. But, it's just interesting to see how that works. And the ending there, I think, is absolutely fascinating. See, at the absolute end, when Vimes kills Nazi werewolf Wolfgang, he does deliberately not give a cool one-liner, and that, I think, that's important. See, a lot of action heroes do exactly that. It's your yippee-ki-yay motherfucker and stuff like that. We know that, we expect it from an action hero. And Sam Vimes, when he kills Wolfgang, does not do it. He does deliberately not do it. He even says, Pratchett even gives us like 4 different one-liners that would have worked in that scene and would have made it much cooler. The kind of thing your Harry Dresden would say. And Vimes does not say that, because that would have made what he did murder. And I think that's an important aspect, because something that we often ignore is that people in action movies, in action stories, they're murdering people. They're not actually doing something legal in any way. They're murdering people, and we're kind of cheering them on because our sense of justice is not necessarily bound to laws. So that, I think, is an interesting aspect there. It's also obviously made clear that a lot of what happens with Vimes trying to, on the one hand, do the right thing, and on the other hand, still be as law-abiding as possible. I found that just an interesting, take on the whole subject. And that's something that I really did enjoy. Next part. Modernization. Once again, I feel the idea of Uberwald being an analog or inspired by the former Eastern Bloc is very important, because what happens if such a place suddenly is open to a capitalist rest of the world, all kinds of different groups are fighting, and we see exactly that. We have your good capitalists like the dwarfs, we have the vampire Lady Margalotta, who is also in favor of modernization in a lot of ways, and we have our throwbacks, our really bad throwbacks in this case, hardcore nationalists, to put a finer point on it, Nazis, those being the werewolves, in particular, obviously Wolfgang, the absolute worst and the main enemy here. And it's very interesting because obviously werewolf imagery is something that is already connected to all kinds of Nazi imagery. Their flag with a wolf head with lightning in his mouth. That's very deliberate on Pratchett's part to actually evoke those images. So that's great. And all the other mentions of like purity and strength and joy and stuff like that. Yeah, he's a Nazi. And it's made clear that those people are not human. They are, well, they're something else. They have lost a lot of their humanity. Now, obviously, in this case, he has done so deliberately, but it's because he's also a werewolf and not fully human. But there's more to that, because humanity in Discworld as well is something that you choose, which is why trolls have it, and why dwarves have it. And that's something that Pratchett, I think, deals with interestingly well, and I did love that a lot. Now, this is all over the place because there are so many nuances, so many small things in this book that are worth pointing out because they're so strong. The next large thing is obviously tradition versus modernization, how to change societies, how to change views over time. And that's like the main conflict within the dwarf plot, right? It's whether dwarf society is able to adapt to the fact that female dwarfs kind of want to be female dwarfs and, have gender identity and gender roles. And the way this is dealt with, I feel, is obviously extremely well done, because it shows, how how such change has to come from within a society. It's very difficult to, enforce that from the outside in a lot of ways, which once again harkens back to that colonialism, imperialism kind of imagery that is also in this book, and the fact that some people just can't accept certain changes because they did not have those options when they grew up, which we see with D. I think that's a very human approach because, yeah, if you look to contemporary political discussions, and I don't want to get too political here, but a lot of you have people in the more like older generation feminist discourse who are obviously upset about newer generations of trans people and other people having less of a hard time, or so they think, to get what they had to fight for really hard. It's your general, older generations in general telling people, yeah, we had to walk uphill to both directions and so forth, and you're having it so easy. And there's always that idea of jealousy and sometimes almost hatred there, and an inability to kind of accept these kind of things. So I did like that part a lot. But there's another, very, very strong thing, because it does something when it comes to working through older atrocities. That's something that, especially when we talk about colonialism, is really important. And that's the scene with the troll's head and the human head. Just to remind you, when they walk into the embassy, they find all these hunting trophies, and one of them is a troll's head. And the humans are obviously aghast because they're good modern humans. And they try to talk to Sergeant Detritus, the troll, about it. And, well, first we learn that, of course, it's an old troll there, probably, and they replace the teeth to make him look more fierce and stuff. It's pretty horrific. And then he shows them a bit of a human skull that he inherited from his grandmother. And I have a point here. See, what happens is, he's like, yeah, he gives a speech like, that was in the olden times, now things are much better, and we can, look forward because we want to, actually move forward and find a future together, which is great. But then there's a way more important thing, and that is Sam Vimes asks Detritus whose skull when he shows the human skull, and Detritus answers, and this is the really powerful moment. There's like, did anyone ask the name of this troll? The troll's head. And I'm like, yeah, that's exactly the point, because we're still, when we look at older atrocities, we're still looking at it from a position of strength and power. We think in those situations so often we still care more about our own than the victims of horrific things that our cultures, our societies did in the past. And I just find that a very, very powerful scene in a lot of ways. So just pointing that out. See, Pratchett touches on a lot of things in this book. What more? Well, as I said, there's so much, and I probably can't touch on all of it. But let's look at one thing that I really like: set up and actually pay off. See, there's a great thing that happens with Vimes sitting and watching the opera, and they're waving around, singing, and talking about the Scone of Stone, which is a fantastic joke on the Stone of Scone, of course. But it's also sometimes like, this is not real. You can't actually solve a problem by singing and waving around a bun. And then that's exactly how things are solved when well, they bring back the scone, and Lady Sybil sings the same ransom aria. And that, I think, is a great, great statement on the power of culture, on the power of stories, on all these elements that are not just weapons and laws, but all these other things that make us human, that actually have such an enormous power over how we run our lives, how we do things in our societies, and what actually makes us do things and decide which way to jump, so to speak. So that one, apart from just like being a very subtle setup and payoff, is just great, I think. And once again, it comes back to that important underlying theme of all of Discworld, which is the power of story, the power of imagination, the power of culture in a lot of ways. In this case, it's opera. What else? Well, said recently that these are the books where Pratchett moves on to all kinds of new themes, and he certainly is getting better with gender roles, with female characters. We have Cheery and her struggle with becoming a full-on female dwarf, a recognized female dwarf fighting for her, existence, a right to be who she wants to be. Lady Sybil gets way more agency in this book and actually, kind of saves the day when she sings the aria and stuff like that. The conversation between Angua and Carrot about, their respective relationship and what Angua wants to do and what right or lack of right Carrot has to, meddle in her stuff. That's a really powerful story going on there, and I think that's something that we will see more. It feels like Pratchett has finally realized, or not realized because you knew that before, but has gained the confidence to write female characters more actively into his stories. I think that's how I would explain it, and that's that's another bonus for this book. So great. There's also still a lot of humor, and the conversations between Carrot and Gaspode are fantastic. I mean, Gaspode is one of those characters that I really, really love in these in Discworld, so I'm happy he got a lot of conversations there, which, Pratchett gets to make the fantastic yo bitch joke when Gaspode talks to a wolf, so props for still being, really dumb funny in a way. But there's, clever statements about these kind of things there. And then there's, of course, the ongoing and really interesting subplot with Sergeant Colin being promoted and absolutely incapable of handling the responsibility of being, commander of the watch while no one else is there. And that's an interesting comment on people being pushed into positions of power and overcompensating in all the wrong ways and destroying everything underneath them. I'm not gonna say Twitter, but, look at how people fuck up responsibilities. So there you go. Fantastic subplot. Also, the ongoing joke about Nubby Nubs trying to get promoted and Colin completely ignoring him just shows that Pratchett is still very much capable of writing a very serious book and still having high quality humor that would work well in a theater play or a movie, because you have this ongoing running gag kind of thing coming back again and again, and that's just great. So yeah, I would say The Fifth Elephant in a lot of ways is one of Pratchett's best. I would argue it marks a paradigm shift, so to speak, within the larger Discworld corpus, because Discworld gets modernized in a lot of ways, with the next one, The Truth, and its topic. Yeah, this is where the Industrial Revolution really kicks in Discworld, and that means that society changes in a lot of ways and becomes more complicated to navigate, and all the many things that Pratchett touches upon in this book are just a sign of that. And I think the fact that Terry Pratchett is able to push all of that into, a 400-something page novel is fantastic and shows the true breadth and depth of Discworld and what is possible to do in a serious book that is still very much humorous and reflects the world in all its nuances and complexities in a way that so many other fantasy books just never manage. So those are some of my thoughts on The Fifth Elephant. I hope you liked the book if you read it. If you haven't, why are you still here and not reading the damn book? Yeah, thanks for watching. Please please subscribe. We're 50 subscribers away from 1,000. Wouldn't that be great? If you want to support me, there's a Patreon. I would really, really appreciate that. But, don't feel pushed to. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.